colonial Mysore in the modern sense. And the second lecture would be on history and postmodernist discourse. So in the first lecture, I am planning to share my understanding of the social reforms in the sense that it's been used in different contexts. So now I start my lecture with a quote. In fact, these days with the Zoom and other platforms, they have not been able to meet and have the eye-to-eye contact. Which I was I was very happy as a teacher when I was with my students, but unfortunately, that part of the happiness is missing here. Anyway, now I would start my lecture by quoting a couple of which I feel have great significance to what I'm going to speak today. Because as students of history, we must be familiar with certain very fundamental notions about history or the philosophical basis of history. So there, I'm fond of a couple of, sayings. Now, one of the very important foundational sayings, which I have always enjoyed listening and also trying to contextualize is, at the beginning, there was no beginning, and at the end, there is no end. This is one of the very foundational aspects or the features of history. We try to categorize history as ancient, medieval, modern. But if we remove this perspective of history and look at the human existence, then we would understand how, we fail to see the very beginning of human existence. And now, if someone says that there is an end, nothing ends like that, and it would get transformed into something else. So therefore, one of the very foundational aspects of history in its philosophical sense is this: at the beginning, there was no beginning, and at the end, there is no end. Secondly, as students of history, we tend to think again in terms of the disjointed notions of ancient, medieval, and modern. But in certain sense, they look like disjointed, but they always have a sense of connectivity. They live in the present. In the sense, both past and future, they live in the present, which has been very beautifully characterized by one of the 20th century great literatures of English literary world, namely T.S. Eliot, who says, time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future and time future contained in the time past. I repeat it. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future and time future contained in the time past. See, if you carefully analyze this statement, you would understand that how something looks like past, but it is no more past. Something looks like present, it's already a past and also connected to the future. So in that sense, past, present, and future also are connected organically at certain levels. Why I'm saying all this? Because to understand the social history of humankind, of different societies, we need to understand how these social structures have been created and sustained for centuries and centuries and centuries together. And these social structures which were created, they exist and they continue to exist in different manifestations. So therefore, we need to understand what was created as an institution of caste. It did not perish. It's passed on. It's living. Probably in the future, it may live, but with different manifestations. So in that sense, we need to understand that history, it's not just the past, it's also the present, it is also the future. So in this background, I try to contextualize the history of social reforms, particularly taking our own country as a context. Now, how do we begin to understand the concept of social reform? Now, before we go into the contextualization of social reform, it is very pertinent for us to understand the meaning of social reform. Many times we will not be able to, see the real context of it, because we are not clear about the meaning, the very foundational or the definitional meaning of this expression called social reform. Why I'm saying this? There are expressions like social reform, social work, social service. So are they same or different? Most of the times, wherever I have encountered, my students with this question, most of them, they were not clear about the meaning of each one of these expressions. So therefore, it is necessary for us to understand the meaning of the term social reform. N.G. Chandavarkar, one of the social reformers of modern Maharashtra, he gives almost an acceptable kind of a definition for the meaning of social reform. So what is that? He writes, social reform aims at a change sometimes involving the basic values of a society, whereas social work and social service function within the existing value system. I repeat, this is very, very important, significant to understand. Excuse me. Hello. Hello.
You are audible, sir.
Audible. I think there was some noise in between. Okay. So now social reform in that sense, I was about to repeat that. Social reform aims at a change sometimes involving the basic values of a society, whereas social work and social service function within the existing value system. What's the meaning of that? The meaning is simple. In social reform context, we question the existing value system. We question the guidelines of a society, which are emanated from certain sources. But whereas in social work and social service, we don't question, but we try to address the issues. Like, for example, now whenever we encounter a beggar, okay, generally we don't question why this man should remain a beggar, why that institution should be existing when we have a government like this. That's the attitude of a social reform, because he questions the very, very basis of the institution, which is not acceptable to civil society. Whereas people at their level, if they feel like helping someone, with some disability, they can give some charity, they can help them. So that's the basic difference between a mind of social reform and a mind of social service and social work. So this fundamental difference, if we understand, then we can get into the domain of understanding social reform in the I think someone should unmute. I think everyone should unmute except myself, because in between, if there is any voice, it distracts the attention.
Sridhar Naik, please.
Okay. Okay. So now I'll come to Indian context first, and then I'll come down to Mysorean context. So now in the Indian context, when we speak of the social reform, from where do we begin? This is the issue. Now, if we take the meaning of social reform as has been explained earlier, then we can start this attitude of social reform from a discourse within the Upanishad literature itself. If you closely get into Upanishad literature, you have various discourses there on number of issues. Now, for example, if you take the example of Aruni Uddalaka, so you would find a huge discourse on epistemological pursuits, in the sense that he wouldn't accept what's been just taught in the text. He would go beyond that, Aruni Uddalaka. So if you closely read Upanishad literature, you would understand how there is a huge reflection of the social change attitude within the Upanishad literature. In our own context, in the modern period, if we take the example of Brahma Samaj, it relied on the understanding of Upanishads. It did not take Vedas as as a base text to understand the social change desire. Whereas if you take the example of Arya Samaj, they took Vedas as the referential works, for their understanding of the social reform. So if you look at these two differences, the difference between Brahma Samaj and its philosophical foundation, Arya Samaj and its philosophical foundation in terms of social change that they envision, then we would understand how there is a huge difference between Vedic literature and the Upanishad literature. So what I'm trying to say here is that, that very attitude of social reform you could find from that period onwards. But for our understanding, most of the texts, have tried to contextualize social reform, from Shramanic traditions onwards. Now, whenever there is an issue of social reform, we start from the debate on Jainism, Buddhism, Ajivikas, and such Shramanic traditions. So these are the Shramanic traditions which did not approve of Vedas as the infallible, source for the social order, or social institutions, or social structure. So therefore, in the second stage, on the major change historically, what we find is the emergence of these Shramanic, religions, Shramanic cultures, which questioned the very basis and the claims of infallibility of the Shastras. So therefore, that was the very important stage that we find in the history of social reform. In the third stage, when we come to the medieval period, you would find during the medieval period, you would increasingly find the devotional sense of social reform. In the sense, they questioned certain existing value systems, but they questioned it through the mode of devotion. So this devotional mode is very significant during the medieval period. Then we would enter into the modern period. Now, when we come to the modern period, we have to understand that European, modernism or colonialism is too central to understand the social changes of the modern India, including the princely state of Mysore. If we are not able to understand the structure of colonialism, the structure of epistemological pursuits of this colonial power center, then we will not be able to understand and appreciate and contextualize the meaning of the social reform. Therefore, when we come to the modern period, the very significant thing is we need to understand the nature of colonialism, how colonialism, at the cost of enriching their own economy, they wanted to impose the cultural hegemony on the subordinate countries, or the countries under their control. So therefore, the modern period is a very significant period, which is totally a deviation from the earlier periods. Now, what is so significant about this colonial period? What did this colonial power structure do? There, to understand the colonial power structure, we need to understand that the colonialism, it brought in several streams of ideological basis for their administration in India. So one such very important ideological foundations, or the ideological basis that they wanted to create for their ruling, was the introduction of utilitarian philosophy. Utilitarian philosophy is too significant and too central to understand the nature of the colonialism. What is utilitarian philosophy? Utilitarian philosophy basically believed that the utility of any particular policy, or whatever it is best appreciated in terms of the positive or the negative effect that it creates. If some introduction of some policy creates a very good positive effect, then that is good for the people. So therefore, the basic philosophy is maximum good of the maximum number is the foundational philosophy of utilitarianism. So there, one of the very significant things that they wanted to introduce was the government intervention in the social policies to be formulated. The government intervention was too significant to address the issues of social reform. Now, what were the major social reform issues during this period that we find as too significant, which developed distinctive discourses during this period? There were two significant areas. Number one, the area of the caste system. Number two, the area of gender. The issues of women. So issues of women and the issues of the caste were two major domains that were completely engaged by the social reformers. You look at any social reformer in the modern period, invariably they were engaged either with the issues of the women or issues of the caste system, or both sometimes. So therefore, in the modern period, during the colonial period, the very important and significant thing that we need to understand is that these two important domains, social domains, were engaged by the social reformers. Now, we have these institutions like Brahma Samaj, Arya Samaj, the Software Society, Ramakrishna Mission. So all these things, they try to address these issues in their own ways. And next thing I want to emphasize here is that how within the social reform domain, there were different models being developed by different schools of reformers. This is another very significant thing that we need to understand. Most of the times, we tend to think that social reform movement is a monolith. You know what is monolith? That means it's all the same, whether Radha Mohan does it, or Keshav Chandra Sen does it, or Dayananda Saraswati does it, or Vivekananda does it, or whoever does it, it's all the same. No, there are different models that we need to identify, looking at the modus operandi of different schools. Now, I'll specifically come down to the South India and give a couple of examples, then I'll move to Mysore. Now, for example, in South India, we have the different schools of social reforms. One school that was represented by Narayan. One school that was represented by Narayan Guru. Now, Narayan Guru is too significant to understand the social changes of modern Kerala. So unless we understand the models, a model that's been developed by Narayan Guru, we will not be able to understand what he did. Now, to understand Narayan Guru, we need to understand that he based his social reform activities within the structure of Advaita philosophy. In fact, he starts his school, Advaita school also he starts. So what is this Advaita philosophy? Everything is one. There is God in every being. So this is the kind of the philosophy that he developed. But if you closely look at the way that he carried out the social reform, you would understand that he advocated modern education for the socially disadvantaged classes as a means of liberation, or in other words, simple words, for him, English education was a tool to liberate people from the subordinate classes or the untouchable classes, the social, in the sense of pedagogical, the communities which are at the bottom. So therefore, he advocated that education be the foundational tool to bring in social reform. And most significant thing is that temple entry was an issue. If you closely observe the modern social reform movement, temple entry was an issue. In Kerala, temple entry was a huge issue for the the downtrodden classes. In fact, though he belonged to Yeluvaga community, a Tadi, chopping community, that community was, understood as a community of, untouchables. So therefore, that community, but in Karnataka context, it's a different sense. But in Kerala context, it was considered as an untouchable community. And then what he did, he started a temple, or he constructed a small temple at Aravipuram. There's a place called Aravipuram in Kerala. And in 1888, he constructed a temple. And when there were objections that, without following certain Vedic traditions and Vedic, parameters, that no temple can be sanctified, was the claim of the other communities. When that was put forth as an argument, then he said, he is our Shiva. He is a Ilva Shiva. If you want to come and express your devotion, you can do that. We have no issues. But if you think that only your Shiva is the whole Shiva, I'm sorry, no. He is our Shiva. We will worship him. For us, he is our Shiva. Finished. So therefore, remain within the Advaita fold. See, this is too significant to understand. He did not reject the temple, temple as an institution of boycott. He rather accepted that, and he opened the temple so that people could feel liberated from the Vedic clutches, the traditional, hierarchical clutches. So therefore, if you see that kind of a very distinctive mode of apprehending in Narayanpur. But if you take the example of Periyar, Periyar totally rejects this temple culture. For him, the priestly class is the class of culprit. They destroyed everything, and he would go to any extent. And Periyar, he rejected the superiority, and he proposed the idea of Dravidastan. He went to such an extent that Dravidas must constitute a separate entity and a separate country. He went to that extent. So therefore, one accepts the religion and remains within the religion, but tries to express a dissent, remaining within the religion. That is one way of protest when we look at Narayan Guru. The other one, he doesn't remain within the religious fold of the Vedic traditions, and he wants to go out of that and express his protest. So this is another kind of a model that you find. When we go to the Pule, in fact, he preceded both these two reformers, because he lived somewhere between 1827 and 1890. And if you closely read his texts, Gulamgiri and Shet Karyacha Asud, you understand that he proposed education as the means of liberation. And number two, he included even other classes in the ambit of social reforms, like the labor class, like the agriculturists. And he said how these classes were exploited at the hands of both moneylenders and the government. So this is the kind of reform that he tried to project. And now I'll come to the Mysorean model. What is the Mysorean model? Mysorean model, we find that in the manifesto of Prajamitra Mandali. The first non-Brahmin political organization was started in Mysore on the 6th of December 1917. And the manifesto of non-Brahmin movement, non-Brahmin organization called Prajamitra Mandali, was prepared by C.R. Reddy, means Kattamanchi Ramalinga Reddy, a man from Chittoor, who was the product of Madras Christian College. Later, he went to Cambridge and he obtained his MA in English literature, and he entered the service of Mysore as a teacher at Maharaja's College in 1909, the same year when Vishesharaya became the chief engineer of Mysore. See, now you can see we are entering into the Mysore. Now, this is the period when there were a huge number of questions being raised on the social issues. Now, as far as Mysore is concerned, how do we understand the social reform movement of the Mysore state? Again, to understand the Mysorean social reform, we have our own history. Now, for example, the 12th century Basava movement, Shivasharana Basava movement, is very significant movement. It laid a certain foundational background to the notion of social reform in princely Mysore. I mean, directly, it did not happen in princely Mysore, but the effect of that movement was also there found in Mysorean area also, princely Mysore a little later. So what I'm trying to say here is that um, at the back of the modern social reforms, there were movements which happened earlier, which created a certain foundational background to these movements, like the Basava movement of the 12th century, and much later during the 15th, 16th century, particularly, you find the Dasa movement. So Purandara Dasa, Kanaka Dasa, Jagannatha Dasa, there were many Dasas who also, laid a certain foundations to the understanding of the social reform movements. So now, when we come to the modern period, particularly to the issue of Mysore social reforms, we need to understand the colonialism. Unless we understand the colonialism, we will not be able to understand the the Mysorean social reform movement. So, what is so significant about the colonialism? Now, to bring it to your notice, I need to tell you a certain political background, a very brief political background to understand the social context of Mysore. Now, Mysore state was created, at the end of the 14th century, and 25 rulers ruled the state, and intermittently, it was also under different, political power centers. And when we come to the modern period, particularly after Tipu Sultan's period, this state of Mysore was taken over by the British, under their direct administration between 1880, I'm sorry, 1880, I'm sorry, 1831 to 1881. 1831 to 1881. 50 years of the period, Mysore was directly under the control of the British, under the, commissioners. They were called as the commissioners. These details maybe those who are from Karnataka, the participants, those who are from Karnataka, they are familiar with, but the participants from outside Karnataka, they may not be familiar with this, part of history. Now, during this time, 1831 to 1881, we find the commissioners ruling over the state. There were 7 commissioners who ruled over the state, and these commissioners laid the foundation for the utilitarian philosophy in the matters of Mysorean administration. So it was the time that they introduced a new educational system. It was the time they introduced a new judicial system. It was the time they introduced a new, economic policies into the state of Mysore, and land became the marketable commodity. So all these major changes were there, being being the hallmark of the commissioner's rule in Mysore between 1831 and 1881. 1881, again, Mysore was given back to the Wadayar's family. Now, this 50 years period is significant because it was during this period Christian missions played a very dominant role. Now, to understand the role of the Christian missions, again, we need to go back to the beginning days of the 19th century. There were 4 charter tracts being introduced by the British in India. 1793 and 1813 and 1833 and 1853. So there were 4 charter tracts being introduced. But the second charter act was very significant. The charter act of 1813, as far as the social reform issues are concerned, because it was under the charter act of 1813 that the Christian missions were permitted to establish their institutions in different parts of India. And naturally, It also applied to the Mysorean area, and from 1820 and onwards, there were several Christian missionary institutions were established in different parts of the Mysore state. Now, the Western Mission, Methodist Mission, and the London Missionary Society, Basil Mission, majorly, so these three are very significant to understand the social history of modern India. So, what happened during this time? During this time, the missionaries, with their agenda of conversion, religious conversion of the natives, they aggressively carried out the attack on the native traditions, the religious traditions, the social traditions, and particularly the practice of untouchability, and also the basic rights being denied to women. So these things were also very important, and they were addressed to by the Christian missions. Why they picked up these issues? For two reasons. One, the utilitarian philosophy itself advocated that the social harmony to be established, and number two, it was largely under the policy of colonial expansion. So the colonialism, to justify its own expansion, they indulged in such kind of activities also. So that is also a part of that. So therefore, during this period, you would see a number of new institutions being introduced. Now, as far as the social reform was concerned, a new movement was emerged during this time, called removal of civil disabilities of native Christian converts. I repeat that movement: removal of the disabilities of native Christian converts. This is the nomenclature of the movement initiated by the Christian missionaries in the state of Mysore. Now, what was the significant aspect of this movement for the removal of civil disabilities of Christian natives in princely Mysore? There were two important issues that were contemplated by the missionary enterprise. In British India, two acts were introduced. The two acts were, number one, Act 21 of 1850 and Act 21 of 1866. Now, Act 21 of 1850, it provided a provision for rights, the property rights over the ancestral property, or the rights over the ancestral property for the converts. These acts were confined only to the converts. They were not extendable to the other native population. They were applied only to the converts. So the moment a person from this social structure or fold was converted into Christianity, he had to forfeit his claims over his ancestral property, which they thought was a biggest impediment, a biggest obstacle for expansionist policy of their conversion. So therefore, they wanted to remedy that, and they introduced this Act 21 of 1850. And number two, the Act 21 of 1866, which basically gave women the liberty to divorce. The liberty to divorce, because unless there was a provision for divorce, they thought that the conversion activities may not go as expected if there are provisions for the divorce, because there were several cases like that, which came up. For example, there was one case called Dasappa versus Chikkamma case from Tumpur. That was an important case. And similarly, there were several cases coming up. And these cases amply demonstrated that it was time the Christian missions thought that they should have a provision for divorce also, which was not allowed under the other regulations. Now, these two acts, they thought were the necessity and urgent, an urgency to be introduced into the Mysore state. When it was proposed to the government for the introduction of these two acts, the government was hesitant. Though we had a colonial government between 1831 and 1881, still it was too hesitant because they never, were able to understand how the natives would react for that. So it was the time then the natives started reacting to these developments. And there was also another issue under the caption, the removal of the disabilities of native Christian converts. The disability was the Christian converts were not allowed to draw water from the wells commonly used by the caste Hindus. I repeat that. The converts were not allowed to draw water from the wells commonly used by the caste Hindus. Earlier they were allowed, not all converts were, untouchables. There were converts who also belonged to the touchable communities. Earlier to their conversion, they were allowed to draw water from the wells or the water sources from commonly used by all caste Hindus. But once now they are converted, they are not, allowed to draw water from these sources, which was another a major issue for hello. Am I going? Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Because there is one message. Sounds like you might have switched to. Okay.
It's going on properly, sir. No issue.
Okay. Okay. I'll continue. So
Crystal clear.
the other issue was this: the issue of drawing water, from the water sources, water bodies, commonly used by all caste Hindus. This was the issue. So the missions took up this issue. These issues were, were quite a few in number. I have seen the archival records that such issues were reported from Chenapatna, from Shitlghatta, then Chikbalapura, and even from Tumkur district. There were many such issues from different parts of the Mysore state, particularly the issue related to the water drying. So therefore, this was also another important issue. Now the Christian missions, particularly the London Missionary Society and the Western Methodist missions, they aggressively followed the policy of persuasion, to pressurize the government to bring in certain legislative, enactments to put an end to these disabilities which they thought was the disability. Now, there was one very interesting case in 1870s came up in the state of Mysore. It's very famously known as the case of Huchi. The name of the girl was Huchi. It doesn't mean that she was, insane. She was mad. No, she was perfectly all right. She was the student of London Missionary Society School. And as a student, eventually she developed some interest, in the Bible. And she was, in a way, preparing herself to be converted to the Christianity. So this was witnessed by this development or this change in her attitude was witnessed by, few of her friends, and it reached their house. The news reached their house. And now what they did was, they withdrew her from the school. They came to school, they persuaded, and they quarreled with the management, and they persuaded, and the Christian missionary school management, they said, no, we never force anybody. If someone is volunteering, it's our duty to give their protection to, such people who are interested in the baptism. So therefore, they said, if they are volunteering, we have no issues. We will give them protection. If they are not interested, we will never force anybody. And that was their plan. But now, this lady developed a leaning towards that. Now, what happened? She was withdrawn from the school. She was taken to her, home, and in a hurry, they saw a groom, and she was married off. She was married off to a person by name, Appaya from Devanhalli. Okay. So now she was confined, she was married, all that was being carried out. Still, that lady did not lose interest in baptism. She continued to, show interest to go back to school and go back for, accepting the baptism. So she was planning, she was confined to a place, all that was there, but somehow she was able to establish contact with the school through, a couple of her classmates. And finally, she managed to escape from home, ran away and joined the school. And now she was given the total protection by the school. And she was, when she said she was interested in baptism, efforts also were being made. And these family people went there, quarreled with them, and there was ruckus. All kinds of things were there, but still they did not enter because they invoked the police protection to this girl. And it's a huge story. I don't want to elaborate that. And the final stage, this case was taken up by the Christian missions, not only from Mysore, from across South India, through their various platforms, and that went up to London. So it was a very huge issue and a very huge challenge for even the missionaries also. But finally, the London episode, the challenge being made by these people did not bring any final solution to this issue. There is a very, very conflicting, versions about it. But what I understand finally that no solution was given to this issue even at the London. And finally, by 1910, this movement eventually in 1910 around, this movement almost saw its end. So this is one part of the social reform activities. Now, another part is that once the native government took over in 1881, the native government started the attempts towards the social reform. This is the next phase what we find in Mysore. Should I be talking in Kannada also for some time? I mean, part of it? I don't know if it's more.
No, sir. Majority are people from different parts of the country.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. And about
ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಹೇಳಿ ಸರ್ ನಡೀತದೆ ಕನ್ನಡ ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ಎಕ್ಸಾಮ್ ಕನ್ವರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಸರ್ ಏನಾಯ್ತು
ಸರ್ ಮಧ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಕನ್ನಡ ಹೇಳಿ ಸರ್ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಸರ್.
ನಾನು ಇಲ್ಲಿವರೆಗೂ ಏನ್ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಈ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆ ಎರಡು ಕಾಂಟೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ಗಳಿದೆ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆಗೆ ಅಂತ. ಒಂದು ಭಾರತದ ಕಾಂಟೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್, ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಮೈಸೂರಿನ ಕಾಂಟೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್. ಎರಡು ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದಂತ ಭೂಮಿಕೆಗಳಿದಾವೆ. ಈ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆ ಭಾರತದ ಕಾಂಟೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಹೇಗಾಯ್ತು ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ನೋಡೋದಕ್ಕೆ ನಾವು ಪೂರ್ವಭಾವಿಯಾಗಿ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಏನು ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು. ಅದನ್ನ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳಿದೆ ನಾನು. ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಈಗ ನಮಗೆ ವೇದಗಳೇ ನಮ್ಮ ಪ್ರಮಾಣದ ಗ್ರಂಥಗಳು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಹೇಳುವಾಗ ಅದನ್ನ ಪ್ರಮಾಣ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ಳದೆ ಇರುವಂತಹ ಟ್ರೆಡಿಷನ್ಸ್ ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿ ಡೆವಲಪ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಅದನ್ನ ನಾವು ಶ್ರಮಣಿಕ್ ಟ್ರೆಡಿಷನ್ಸ್ ಅಂತಲೂ ಕೂಡ ನಾವು ಕರಿತೀವಿ. ಸೊ ಹೀಗೆ ಯಾವುದೇ ಒಂದು ಮೌಲ್ಯ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಯ ಪ್ರಮಾಣವನ್ನ ಪ್ರಶ್ನಿಸುವ ಒಂದು ಮನೋಧರ್ಮವೇ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ನಾವು ಬ್ರಾಡ್ ಆಗಿ ಆ ತರದ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತೇವೆ. ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಏನು ಸ್ಥಾಪಿತವಾದಂತಹ ಮೌಲ್ಯಗಳಿದಾವೆ ಅದನ್ನ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಮಾಡುವಂತಹ ಮನೋಧರ್ಮ. ಈಗಾಗಲೇ ಒಂದು ಉದಾಹರಣೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟೆ ನಾನು. ಏನು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಒಬ್ಬ ಭಿಕ್ಷುಕ ಬಂದಾಗ ಒಬ್ಬರಿಗೆ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಬರ್ಬೋದು ಮನಸ್ಸಿನಲ್ಲಿ, ಇವನು ಯಾಕೆ ಭಿಕ್ಷುಕನಾಗಿರ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ. ಈ ತರದ ನಾಗರಿಕ ಸಮಾಜದಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಇರೋದು ಯಾಕೆ? ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಇರೋದು ಯಾಕೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಈ ತರದ ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳಿಗೆ ಪರಿಹಾರವನ್ನು ಕಂಡುಕೊಳ್ಳೋಕೆ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಇರೋದು. ಇವಕ್ಕೆ ಪರಿಹಾರ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಯಾಕಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಯನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು. ಅವನು ಯಾರು ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಯನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ ಅವನು ಸುಧಾರಕ ಆಗ್ತಾನೆ. ಅವನಿಗೆ ಆ ಇಡೀ ಏನೋ ಇದನ್ನ ಎಂಥದ್ದು ಬೆಗರಿ ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು. ಆದ್ರೆ ಇನ್ನೊಬ್ರು ಯಾರಿಗೋ ಅವನೇನೋ ಪಾಪ ಕಷ್ಟದಲ್ಲಿದ್ದಾನೆ, ಅವ್ನಿಗೇನೋ ಅವ್ನಿಗೆ 10 ರೂಪಾಯಿ ಕೊಡೋದು ಅಥವಾ ಇನ್ನೇನೋ ಒಂದು ಅಥವಾ ತಿಂಡಿ ಕೊಡಿಸೋದು ಅಥವಾ ಇನ್ನೊಂದೇನೋ ಮಾಡೋದು, ಈ ತರ ತಮ್ಮ ಕೈಲಾದಂತ ಸಹಾಯವನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ತಿರ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಹೀಗಾಗಿ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆ ಮತ್ತು ಸಮಾಜ ಸೇವೆ, ಸಮಾಜ ಕಾರ್ಯ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಆಗ್ತವೆ ಅಂತ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಮೂಲಭೂತವಾಗಿ ನಾವು ತಿಳ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣಾ ಇತಿಹಾಸವನ್ನು ಎಲ್ಲಿಂದ ನೋಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಉಪನಿಷತ್ ಲಿಟರೇಚರ್ ಅನ್ನು ಬಹಳ ಕ್ಲೋಸ್ ಆಗಿ ಗಮನಿಸಿದ್ರೆ ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ರೀತಿಯ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಮಾಡುವ ಮನೋಧರ್ಮಗಳು ಬೇಕಾದಷ್ಟು ನಮಗೆ ಕಾಣ್ತವೆ. ಹೊರಡಿ ಉದ್ದಾಲಕನ ಕಥೆಯನ್ನ ನೋಡ್ಕೊಂಡ್ರೆ ನಿಮಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಆ ಥರದ್ದು ಬೇಕಾದಷ್ಟು ಎಪಿಸೋಡ್ಸ್ ಬರ್ತವೆ. ಸೊ ನಾವು ಮೇಜರ್ ಆಗಿ ಈ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆಯ ಹಂತಗಳನ್ನ ಕಾಣೋದಿಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಜೈನ ಧರ್ಮ, ಬೌದ್ಧ ಧರ್ಮ, ಅಜೀವಿಕ ಪರಂಪರೆ, ಈ ತರದ ಪರಂಪರೆಗಳು ಬಂದಾಗ ಅವುಗಳು ವೇದಗಳನ್ನ ಪ್ರಮಾಣೀಕೃತ ಗ್ರಂಥಗಳು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಹೀಗಾಗಿ ಅವರು ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆಗೆ ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಚಾರಿತ್ರಿಕವಾದಂಥ ಚಾಲನೆಯನ್ನ ಕೊಟ್ಟದನ್ನ ಕಾಣ್ತೀವಿ ನಾವು. ಸೊ ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಈ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣಾ ಪ್ರಕ್ರಿಯೆಗಳು ನಿರಂತರವಾಗಿ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ನಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬಂದಿರುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ನಾವು ಕಾಣ್ತೀವಿ. ಅದು ಬಹಳ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದು. ಸೊ ಈ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣಾ ಈ ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಚರಿತ್ರೆ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ಪ್ರಾಚೀನ ಕಾಲದಿಂದ ಹಿಡಿದು ಮಧ್ಯಕಾಲೀನ ಮತ್ತು ಆಧುನಿಕ ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟವರೆಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಬಂದಿರುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ಕಾಣ್ತೀವಿ. ಇದು ಒಂದು ಭಾಗ. ಈ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಬಹುತೇಕ ನಾವು ಸಾಮಾನ್ಯವಾಗಿ ಒಂದು ಮೊನೋಲಿತ್ ಅಥವಾ ಅದು ಏಕೀಕೃತವಾದಂಥ ಒಂದು ವಾದವೇನೋ ಅಥವಾ ಒಂದು ಫಿಲಾಸಫಿ ಏನೋ ಅನ್ನೋ ಥರ ನಾವು ಅದನ್ನ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತೀವಿ. ಹಾಗಲ್ಲ, ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆಗಳಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಭಿನ್ನ ಧಾರೆಗಳಿದಾವೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ನಾವು ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತೀವಿ. ಈಗ ಬ್ರಹ್ಮ ಸಮಾಜ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು ಅವರು ವೇದಗಳನ್ನ ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿಲ್ಲ, ಉಪನಿಷತ್ತುಗಳನ್ನ ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಆರ್ಯ ಸಮಾಜ ವೇದಗಳನ್ನ ಪ್ರಮಾಣೀಕೃತ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ತದೆ. ಹಾಗೆ ನೀವು ವಿವೇಕಾನಂದರನ್ನ ನೀವು ಬಂದಾಗ ಅವರು ಕೆಲವು ಕಡೆ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ, ಕೆಲವು ಕಡೆ ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಕೆಲವು ಕಡೆ ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಅದು ಅವರು ಬೇರೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅದನ್ನ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ನಿಮಗೆ ಬ್ರಿಜ್ರಂಜನ ಮಣಿ ಅವ್ರದ್ದು ಡಿಬ್ರಾಮಿನೈಸಿಂಗ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ನೋಡಿದ್ರೆ ನಿಮಗೆ ಒಂದಷ್ಟು ವಿವರಗಳು ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ನಂತರ ಈ ಮೆಡಿವಲ್ ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ನಾವು ಬಂದಾಗ ಈ ಡಿವೋಷನ್ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಅಥವಾ ಭಕ್ತಿ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ ಪರಂಪರೆ ಬಹಳ ಪ್ರಧಾನವಾಗಿ ಕಾಣ್ತದೆ. ಆ ಭಕ್ತಿ ಪ್ರಧಾನವಾಗಿ ಕಾಣುವಂತಹ ಆ ಪರಂಪರೆ, ಆ ಭಕ್ತಿಯ ಮುಖಾಂತರವೇ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳನ್ನು ಕೇಳುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಪರಂಪರೆಯನ್ನ ಕಾಣ್ತೀವಿ ನಾವು. ನೀವು ಇಡೀ ಮೆಡಿವಲ್ ಪೀರಿಯಡ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಬರುವಂತ ಬೇಕಾದಷ್ಟು ಸೈನ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಅವರೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಕೂಡ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ನಮಗೆ ಪುರಂದರದಾಸ, ಕನಕದಾಸ, ಜಗನ್ನಾಥದಾಸ ಈ ತರದ ದಾಸ ಪರಂಪರೆಯನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ನೀವು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಗಮನಿಸಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಇದೆ ಅಂತ. ಸೊ ಆಧುನಿಕ ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದಾಗ ನಾನು ಈ ಒಂದು ಉದಾಹರಣೆನ ಹೇಳಿದೆ. ಹಾಗೆ ದಕ್ಷಿಣ ಭಾರತಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದಾಗ ನಾವು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ರೀತಿಯ ಮಾಡೆಲ್ಗಳನ್ನ ಇನ್ನೂ ಕೂಡ ಕಾಣ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂತ. ಒಂದು ಮಾಡೆಲ್ ಯಾವುದು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ಈಗ ನಾರಾಯಣ ಗುರು ಅವರ ಮಾಡೆಲ್. ಅವ್ರೇನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ, ಈ ಧಾರ್ಮಿಕ ಪರಂಪರೆಯ ಒಳಗಡೆನೆ ಇರ್ತಾರೆ, ಅದನ್ನು ಧಿಕ್ಕರಿಸೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಅವ್ರು ಏನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ, ಈಗ ನಿಮ್ಮ ದೇವರಿಗೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಪ್ರವೇಶ ಬೇಡ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ನೀವು ಸೇರಿಸಲ್ಲ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ನಮ್ದೇ ಆದಂತ ದೇವಾಲಯಗಳನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಟ್ಕೋತೀವಪ್ಪ, ನಮ್ಮ ಶಿವನನ್ನ ನಾವು ಸ್ಥಾಪನೆ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋತೀವಪ್ಪ ಅಂತ. ರವಿಪುರಂದು ಉದಾಹರಣೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದಲ್ಲ, 1888 ಕಟ್ಟಿರುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಸೊ ಈ ತರದ ಅವ್ರು ಮಾಡೆಲ್ ಅದು. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಅದ್ವೈತ ಪರಂಪರೆಯ ಒಳಗಡೆನೆ ಇತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಆ ಧಾರ್ಮಿಕ ಪರಂಪರೆಯ ಒಳಗಡೆ ಮತ್ತು ಅದರ ಭಾಗವಾಗಿ ಇದ್ಕೊಂಡು ಅದರ ಒಳಗಡೆಯಿಂದನೇ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರತಿರೋಧವನ್ನ ತೋರಿಸುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಮಾಡೆಲ್ ಅದು. ಆದ್ರೆ ನೀವು ಪೆರಿಯಾರಿಗೆ ಬಂದಾಗ ಅವರು ಆ ಇಡೀ ಮಾಡೆಲ್ ಅನ್ನ ಇಡಿಯಾಗಿ ಧಿಕ್ಕರಿಸ್ತಾರೆ. ಅದು ಅವರ ಪ್ರಕಾರ ವೈದಿಕ ಮತ್ತು ಈ ಮೇಲ್ ಜಾತಿಗಳ ಒಂದು ಏನು ಅವ್ರೇನ್ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಬಹಳ ಕಟುವಾಗಿ ಟೀಕಿಸ್ತಿರ್ತಾರೆ ಯಾರು ಪೇಯಾರು. ಅವ್ರು ಆ ಇಡೀ ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಚರ್ನೇ ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಅವ್ರು ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದಿರ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ಈ ದ್ರಾವಿಡ ಅನ್ನುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಪರಿಕಲ್ಪನೆಯನ್ನ ಹುಟ್ಟಾಕಿ ಅಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಬಂದು ನಿಲ್ತಾರೆ. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಎಲ್ಲಿವರೆಗೂ ಹೋಗ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ದ್ರಾವಿಡ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ ಪ್ರತ್ಯೇಕ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರ ಆಗ್ಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋಷ್ಟು ಮಟ್ಟಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ಅವರು ನಿಲ್ತಾರೆ. ಈ ಉತ್ತರ ಭಾರತದ ವೈದಿಕ ಪರಂಪರೆಯನ್ನ ಅವ್ರು ಯಾವುದಕ್ಕೂ ಕೂಡ ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ಬಾರ್ದು ಅಂತ ಅದನ್ನ ಪ್ರತಿನಿಧಿಸ್ತಾರೆ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಹಾಗೇನೆ ಈ ಧಾರ್ಮಿಕ ಸಿಂಬಲಿಸಮ್ ಕೂಡ ಬಹಳ ಕಟುವಾಗಿ ಟೀಕಿಸ್ತಾರೆ. ರಾಮಾಯಣ, ಮಹಾಭಾರತ ಇತ್ಯಾದಿ, ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ಲಿ ರಾಮಾಯಣ, ಅವ್ರು ರಾಮನನ್ನು ಒಪ್ಪಲ್ಲ, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಹೀರೋ ಯಾರಾದ್ರೂ ರಾವಣ ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಈ ರೀತಿ ಆ ಸಿಂಬಲ್ಗಳನ್ನ, ಈಗ ರಾವಣ ಯಾವುದಕ್ಕೆ ನಿಲ್ತಾನೆ ಪ್ರತೀಕವಾಗಿ, ಹಾಗೆ ರಾಮ ಯಾವುದಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರತೀಕವಾಗಿ ನಿಲ್ತಾರೆ, ಆ ಸಿಂಬಲಿಸಮಿನ ಮುಖಾಂತರವೇನೇ ಅವರು ವೈದಿಕ ಧರ್ಮವನ್ನ ಇಡಿಯಾಗಿ ತಿರಸ್ಕರಿಸುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಮಾಡೆಲ್ ಅನ್ನ ಅವ್ರು ನಂಬ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಹಾಗೆಯೇ ನಮಗೆ ಸತ್ಯಶೋಧಕ ಸಮಾಜದ ಮುಖಾಂತರ ಫುಲೆ ಮತ್ತು ಅವರ ಶ್ರೀಮತಿಯವರು ಸಾವಿತ್ರಿಬಾಯಿ ಫುಲೆ ಅವರು ಕಟ್ಟಿದಂತಹ ಒಂದು ರಿಫಾರ್ಮ್ನ ಮಾಡೆಲ್ ಅದು ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ತರದ್ದು. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಅನ್ನ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣದ ಮುಖಾಂತರ ಒಂದು ಲಿಬರೇಟಿಂಗ್ ಅಥವಾ ಒಂದು ಏನ್ ಹೇಳ್ತೀವಿ ಅದನ್ನ ಬಿಡುಗಡೆಯ ಮಾರ್ಗವಾಗಿ ಅದನ್ನು ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಮತ್ತು ಅವರ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆಯ ಫೋಲ್ಡ್ಗೆ ಅವರು ಕೃಷಿಕರನ್ನು ತಂದುಕೊಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಲೇಬರ್ ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ಅನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ತಂದುಕೊಳ್ತಾರೆ. ನೀವು ಅವರು ಎರಡು ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದಂತಹ ಪುಸ್ತಕಗಳನ್ನ ಓದಬೇಕು. ಒಂದು ಗುಲಾಮ್ಗಿರಿ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ಓದಬೇಕು, ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಶೇಟ್ ಕಾರ್ಯಾಚಾರ್ ಅಸೂದ್ ಅನ್ನುವಂತಹ ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ಪುಸ್ತಕವನ್ನು ಓದಬೇಕು. ಆ ಪುಸ್ತಕಗಳನ್ನು ಓದಿದ್ರೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಮೈಸೂರಿನ ಸಂದರ್ಭಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದಾಗ CR ರೆಡ್ಡಿ ಅವರು ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕಟ್ತಾರೆ. ಆರ್ಥಿಕ ಮಾನದಂಡಗಳನ್ನ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಅವರು ಕಟ್ತಾರೆ. ಅವ್ರು ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಈಗ ಒಂದು ರಾಜ್ಯಕ್ಕೆ ಬರುವಂತಹ ಆದಾಯಗಳ ಮೂಲ ಯಾವುದು? ಆ ಕಾಲಕ್ಕೆ 20ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದ ಆರಂಭದ ಕಾಲಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದು ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ಈ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ರೆವಿನ್ಯೂ ಇಂದ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇರ್ತದೆ, ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಈ ಎಕ್ಸೈಸ್ ಇಂದ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇರ್ತದೆ, ಮತ್ತು ಮೂರನೇದು ಅರಣ್ಯದ ಮುಖಾಂತರ ಬೇಕಾದಷ್ಟು ಸಂಪನ್ಮೂಲಗಳು ಬರ್ತಾ ಇರ್ತವೆ. ಈ ಎಲ್ಲ ಮೂಲಗಳ ಉತ್ಪಾದಕ ಶಕ್ತಿ ಯಾವುದು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಶೂದ್ರರು ಈ ರಾಜ್ಯಕ್ಕೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಬಗೆಯ ವರಮಾನಗಳನ್ನ ತಂದು ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಖರ್ಚು ಮಾಡುವಾಗ ಏನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ ಇವರು? ನಗರಗಳ ಮೇಲೆ, ಶಾಲೆಗಳ ಮೇಲೆ, ಆಸ್ಪತ್ರೆಗಳ ಮೇಲೆ ಖರ್ಚು ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಆ ಕಾಲಕ್ಕಿದ್ದಂತ ನಗರಗಳು ಬಹುತೇಕ ಈ ಮೇಲ್ವರ್ಗದ ಮೇಲ್ ಸಮಾಜದ ಜನರೇ ಹೆಚ್ಚು ಇದ್ದದ್ರಿಂದ ಖರ್ಚು ಮಾಡುವಾಗ ನೀವು ಅದರ ಮೇಲೆ ಖರ್ಚು ಮಾಡೋದ್ರ ಮುಖಾಂತರ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಖರ್ಚು ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಿ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಈ ತರದೊಂದು ಮಾಡೆಲ್ ಅನ್ನ ಅವ್ರು ಬಿಲ್ಡ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಅವರು ಪ್ರಜಾಮಿತ್ರ ಮಂಡಳಿಯ ಮ್ಯಾನಿಫೆಸ್ಟೋ ಬರೆಯುವಾಗ 1917 ಡಿಸೆಂಬರ್ 6ನೇ ತಾರೀಕು ಪ್ರಾರಂಭವಾದಂತ ಪ್ರಜಾಮಿತ್ರ ಮಂಡಳಿ, ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣೇತರ ಚಳುವಳಿ ಹುಟ್ಟಾಕದಂತ ಪ್ರಜಾಮಿತ್ರ ಮಂಡಳಿ, ಆ ಮ್ಯಾನಿಫೆಸ್ಟೋ ನೋಡಿದಾಗ ನಿಮಗೆ ಈ ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟವಾದ ಎಲ್ಲ ವಿವರಗಳು ಕೂಡ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗ್ತವೆ. ಸೊ ಹೀಗೆ ಭಿನ್ನ ಮಾಡೆಲ್ಗಳಿದಾವೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು ಇನ್ನೊಂದು. ನಂತರ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಗಮನಿಸಬೇಕಾದಂಥದ್ದು ಏನಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಮೈಸೂರಿನ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆಯನ್ನ ನಾವು ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳುವಾಗ ಎಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ. ಸೊ ಇದನ್ನ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಮತ್ತೆ 12ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದ ಈ ಶಿವಶರಣ ಬಸವಾದಿ ಶಿವಶರಣರು ಇದಾರಲ್ಲ, ಅವರು ಕಟ್ಟಿದಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಮೂವ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಅನ್ನ ನಾವು ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು. ನಂತರ ಮಧ್ಯಕಾಲಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದಾಗ ಈ ದಾಸ ಪರಂಪರೆಯನ್ನ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು. ಮತ್ತು ಆಧುನಿಕ ಕಾಲಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದಾಗ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ವಸಾಹತುಶಾಹಿ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಬಂದಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ಅದು ಸೃಷ್ಟಿ ಮಾಡದಂತಹ ಹೊಸ ವಿನ್ಯಾಸಗಳನ್ನು ನಾವು ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು. ಈ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ವಸಾಹತುಶಾಹಿ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಸೃಷ್ಟಿಸಿದಂತಹ ಈ ಹೊಸ ವಿನ್ಯಾಸಗಳ ಮೂಲಕ ಈ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆ ಅಂತನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದು ಹೊಸ ಚಾಲನೆ ಸಿಗುತ್ತೆ. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹಳ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಕಾಣುವಂತ ಶಿಫ್ಟ್ ಏನು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ಹಿಂದೆ ಇದ್ದಂತಹ ಚಳುವಳಿಗಳಿಗೆ ಯಾವುದಕ್ಕೂ ಕೂಡ ಕಾನೂನಿನ ಮಾನ್ಯತೆ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಈಗ ವಸಾಹತುಶಾಹಿ ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದಾಗ ಎಲ್ಲವನ್ನೂ ಕೂಡ ಕಾನೂನು ರೀತಿಯ ಅವುಗಳಿಗೆ ಪರಿಹಾರವನ್ನು ಕಂಡುಕೊಳ್ಳುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಸಂವಿಧಾನಾತ್ಮಕ ಮಾರ್ಗ ಇವಾಲ್ವ್ ಆಗುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಸೊ ವಸಾಹತುಶಾಹಿ ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟದಲ್ಲಿ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ಕಾಣುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಬೆಳವಣಿಗೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಎ ಕಾನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಷನಲ್ ಮೆಥಡ್ ಬೀಯಿಂಗ್ ಡೆವಲಪ್ ಡ್ಯೂರಿಂಗ್ ದಿ colonial period. Everything being addressed in terms of a regulation, a rule. ಸೊ ಹೀಗೆ ಮೈಸೂರಿನ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣಾ ಪ್ರಕ್ರಿಯೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ತರದ ಒಂದು ಹೊಸ ಬೆಳವಣಿಗೆಯನ್ನು ಕಾಣ್ತೀವಿ. ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಕ್ರೈಸ್ತ ಮಿಷನರಿಗಳು ಬಹಳ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದಂತಹ ಪಾತ್ರ ವಹಿಸ್ತಾರೆ. 1813ರಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದಂತಹ ಚಾರ್ಟರ್ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಮುಖಾಂತರ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಪ್ರವೇಶ ಸಿಗುತ್ತೆ. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ವೆಸ್ಲೇಯನ್ ಮೆಥಾಡಿಸ್ಟ್ ಮಿಷನ್, ಲಂಡನ್ ಮಿಷನರಿ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ ಮತ್ತು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಅದರಲ್ಲೂ ಇಟಲ್ ಅವರ ಬ್ಯಾಸಲ್ ಮಿಷನ್, ಇವುಗಳು ಹೆಚ್ಚು ಆ ರೀತಿಯ ಕಾರ್ಯಗಳನ್ನ ನಿರ್ವಹಿಸ್ತವೆ. ಸೊ ಇದು ಒಂದು ಭಾಗ. ನಂತರದ ಭಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಮೈಸೂರಿನ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಏನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತು ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಾಗೆ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ. ಸಿ ಹಿಯರ್ ಇನ್ ದ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಸ್ಟೇಜ್, ದಿ ಮೈಸೂರು ಗವರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ವಿಚ್ ಟುಕ್ ಓವರ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ದಿ British commissioners. Now there was a major challenge before this government. What was the challenge? The challenge was to ensure that they are no less efficient compared to the British administration of the British provinces. No less, efficient from the British, British ruled provinces. So this was the major challenge. Now, in the British ruled provinces, social reform activities were one of the major developments that we would see during the closing decades of the 19th century and being continued in the early 20th century. So similarly here, on the lines of the changes that were happening in the British provinces, the changes were advocated in Mysore also. Mysore, it was ruled by a combination of the Maharaja. In 1881, it was Chamaraja Odayar the 10th, who was the Maharaja of Mysore. He was assisted by able divans. Who was the first divan after rendition? It was Rangachar, C. Rangachar, followed by Sheshadri Iyer. And thereafter, you would see, P.N. Krishnamurti, then V.P. Madhavrao, then T. Anandrao, then Visheshraya from 1912-1918, and then Diwan Kantrajaras, Albion Banerjee, then Mirza Ismail. So it's a huge tradition of the divans. During the time of Sheshadri Iyer, there was an attempt to bring in certain social legislations into the Mysore, particularly for the eradication of the infant marriages. There are two kinds of marriages: infant marriages and child marriages. Infant marriages, when they are in the grade itself, they are married off. Okay, so infant and child marriages were a big issue in the state of Mysore, like any other places. So now, in 1891, Government of India introduced an act called the Age of Consent Act. 1891, the Government of India enacted an act called the Age of Consent Act, which banned certain types of the infant and child marriages. Taking the example of the British government of 1891, the princely state also tried to enact a legislation into the state of Mysore. So when the government heard the news that it was enacted in 1891, in 1892 itself, Ashwathnarayana introduced this, issue for the discussion in the Mysore Representative Assembly. In 1892, this issue was introduced in the Mysore Representative Assembly for discussion by the then Diwan Seshadri Iyer, Sir K. Seshadri Iyer. Then once it was introduced, there was an uproar. Members, they were, out and out against the policy of the proposed policy of the government. One member went to the extent of saying that, the government thinks that, it can come up to our, outer vicinity of the house. But now it thinks that it can enter our kitchen, it can enter our puja room. So this is the kind of attack that the representatives started heaping on the Mysore government. But then there was a pressure on the Diwan and probably the, prince also. What was the pressure? To keep in the pace on par with the British India, they had to introduce a certain legislation. If they backtrack, it's a sad reflection from the eyes of the British. So therefore, they didn't want to give the impression that, they were disinterested. So they wanted to move forward and pass the legislation. And then he announced in the assembly that he would send it for the mutts, the heads of the mutts, for their opinion, whether it is in tune with the Shastras or against Shastras. And the major question then was that it was against the Shastras. Then he said, okay, who are the people or the authority to decide whether something is against Shastras or within the Shastras? It was the heads of the mutts. So he said, I would send it to the heads of the mutts for their opinion and elicit their opinion. If this proposed measure, the banning of the infant marriages, is not against the Shastra, definitely we would introduce that. That was the argument of the Diwan. So he introduced that, and then it was as he himself proposed to the members. He sent it for various sent it for opinion addressed to various heads of the mutts. And 1893, he claimed that he had received the opinions of the mutts, and the opinion was that the unanimous opinion of the mutts was that this proposed legislation, particularly the infant marriages issue, was not against the Shastras. It's well within the sanctity of the Shastras. So therefore, he said, no, the proposed measure is not against Shastra. But then the opponents, particularly people who were opposed to this measure, they continued to exert a lot of pressure on the government to discontinue any effort, towards introducing this act. But then finally, in 1894, Seshadri Iyer introduced this act called the Infant Marriages Prevention Regulation 1894. That is the correct nomenclature of the act, and which banned the marriages below the age of 8 and the marriages of men above the age of 50 with the girls below the age of 16. So these provisions, and in case if there is any violation on the part of the people, then they would be fined. In fact, the empirical study showed that between 1894 and 1900, 54 such violations were reported. 54 such cases were reported, and with a fine, they were let off. And here there is also another interesting point, which I would like to share, that Bangalore had two Bangalores. One Bangalore was the princely Bangalore. Other Bangalore was the British Bangalore. 13.5 square miles of Bangalore and directly under the control of the British. It was called the cantonment Bangalore. And the rest of the Bangalore was directly under the control of the Mysore government. Now, the laws applicable to the Mysore, Bangalore were not applicable to the cantonment Bangalore, the British Bangalore. So many people from old Mysore state, they went to the areas of cantonment. They would get married and come back to their original places to circumvent the penalty provisions. So these things are also reported when we look at the history of this measure. So ಇಲ್ಲಿ 1894ರಲ್ಲಿ ಬಾಲ್ಯ ವಿವಾಹವನ್ನ ತೆಗೆದುಹಾಕಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಮೈಸೂರಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಡೆಯಿತು. ಅದು ಯಾವುದರ ಭಾಗವಾಗಿ ನಡೆಯಿತು ಅಂದ್ರೆ 1891ರಲ್ಲಿ ಭಾರತ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಏಜ್ ಆಫ್ ಕನ್ಸೆಂಟ್ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಅನ್ನುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಬಾಲ್ಯ ವಿವಾಹವನ್ನ ತೆಗೆದುಹಾಕುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಕಾನೂನನ್ನ ಜಾರಿಗೊಳಿಸಿತು. ಅವರು ಜಾರಿಗೊಳಿಸಿದ ನಂತರ ಅದನ್ನ ಉದಾಹರಣೆಯಾಗಿ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಮೈಸೂರು ಕೂಡ ಈ ವಿಷಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಹಿಂದುಳಿದಿಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನ ತೋರಿಸೋದಕ್ಕೆ 1894ರಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಒಂದು ಕಾನೂನನ್ನ ಅವರು ಜಾರಿಗೊಳಿಸುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಯತ್ನವನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ತಾಪತ್ರಗಳು ಬರ್ತದೆ. 1892ರಲ್ಲೇ ಒಂದು ಈ ಕಾನೂನನ್ನ ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರತಿನಿಧಿ ಸಭೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಮಂಡಿಸ್ತಾರೆ, ವಿರೋಧ ಬರ್ತದೆ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಧಾರ್ಮಿಕ ಕೇಂದ್ರಗಳ ಮುಖಂಡರುಗಳಿಗೆ ಅಥವಾ ಮಠಾಧೀಶರಿಗೆ ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ಕಳಿಸ್ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯಕ್ಕೆ. ಅವರು ಇಲ್ಲ, ಇದು ಶಾಸ್ತ್ರಗಳಿಗೆ ವಿರುದ್ಧ ಅಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ ಒಪ್ಪಿಗೆಯನ್ನು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂತಹ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ 1893ರಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರತಿನಿಧಿ ಸಭೆ ಮುಂದೆ ಅದನ್ನ ಮಂಡಿಸ್ತಾರೆ. ನಂತರ 1894ರಲ್ಲಿ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ವಿರೋಧ ಇದ್ರೂ ಕೂಡ ಅವರು ಅದನ್ನು ಒಂದು ಕಾನೂನು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಘೋಷಣೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಹೀಗಾಗಿ ಇನ್ಫೆಂಟ್ ಮ್ಯಾರೇಜಸ್ ಪ್ರಿವೆನ್ಷನ್ ರೆಗ್ಯುಲೇಷನ್ 1894 ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು 1894ರಲ್ಲಿ ಜಾರಿಗೊಳಿತು. ಅದು ಜನಾಭಿಪ್ರಾಯದ ವಿರೋಧವಾಗಿಯೂ ಕೂಡ. ಒಂದ್ ವೇಳೆ ಇವತ್ತಿನ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಶಾಸನ ಸಭೆಗಳಿಗೆ ಶಾಸನಾಧಿಕಾರ ಏನಾದ್ರು ಇದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ರೆ ಅವತ್ತು ಈ ಕಾನೂನು ಬರ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯನೇ ಇರ್ತಿರ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಅವತ್ತಿನ ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರತಿನಿಧಿ ಸಭೆಗೆ ಈ ಶಾಸನ ಅಂತ ಒಂದು ಅಧಿಕಾರ ಇರ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತದ್ದು. ಸೊ ನಂತರ 1909ರಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಟ್ಯಾಫೆ ಅಥವಾ ಈ ದೇವದಾಸಿ ಪದ್ಧತಿಯನ್ನ ಒಂದು ಕ್ರಮವನ್ನ ತೆಗೆದುಹಾಕುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಕೆಲಸವನ್ನ ಮೈಸೂರಿನ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಮಾಡ್ತದೆ. ಇದರ ನಂತರದ ಭಾಗ ಈ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಕಾಣುವಂಥದ್ದು ಈ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣೇತರ ಚಳವಳಿಯ ಸ್ವರೂಪದಲ್ಲಿ. ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣೇತರ ಚಳವಳಿಯನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ನಾವು ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆಯ ಭಾಗವಾಗಿ ಅದನ್ನ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ನೋಡ್ಬೇಕು. ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣೇತರ ಚಳವಳಿ ಇಲ್ಲಿ 1905ರಲ್ಲಿ ಮೈಸೂರು ಲಿಂಗಾಯತ್ ಎಜುಕೇಟೆಡ್ ಫಂಡ್ ಅಸೋಸಿಯೇಷನ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಮೊದಲ ಜಾತಿ ಸಂಘ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಆಯಿತು 1905ರ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ. 1906ರಲ್ಲಿ ಒಕ್ಕಲಿಗರ ಸಂಘ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಆಯಿತು. 1909ರಲ್ಲಿ ಮೈಸೂರು ಸೆಂಟ್ರಲ್ ಮಾಮಟನ್ ಅಸೋಸಿಯೇಷನ್ ಅಂತ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಆಯಿತು. 1923ರ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ದೇವಾಂಗ ಸಂಘ, 24ರಲ್ಲಿ ಕುರುಬರ ಸಂಘ, ಅದೇ ವರ್ಷ ಬೇಕಾದಷ್ಟು ಜಾತಿ ಸಂಘಗಳು ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಆಗುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಸೊ 1905ರಲ್ಲಿ ಮೊದಲು ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಆದಂತಹ ಜಾತಿ ಸಂಘದಿಂದ ಹಿಡಿದು 1920ರ ದಶಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಬೇಕಾದಷ್ಟು ಜಾತಿ ಸಂಘಗಳು ಬರುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ಕಾಣ್ತೀವಿ. ಎಲ್ಲೋ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣೇತರ ಈ ಜಾತಿ ಸಂಘಗಳು ಕೊಡುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಈ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣೇತರ ಚಳುವಳಿ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ಅದರ ಹುಟ್ಟಾಕಿದಂತ ಅದರ ಫಿಲಸಾಫಿಕಲ್ ಫೌಂಡೇಶನ್ ಯಾರು ಅಂದ್ರೆ CR ರೆಡ್ಡಿ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ ಮಾತನ್ನ ಈಗಾಗಲೇ ನಾನು ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಅವ್ರ ಜೊತೆ ಇದ್ದಂಥವ್ರು ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ನಾಯಕತ್ವವನ್ನ, ಮುಖಂಡತ್ವವನ್ನು ಕೊಟ್ಟಂಥವ್ರು ಸಾವುಕಾರ ಚೆನ್ನಯ್ಯ, ಎಂ ಬಸವಯ್ಯ ಮುಂತಾದವರೆಲ್ಲರೂ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಅಬ್ದುಲ್ ಕಲಾಂ ಅಂತ ಈ ತರದವರೆಲ್ಲ ಇದ್ರು ಅಲ್ಲಿ. ಸೊ ಅದರ ಪರಿಣಾಮವಾಗಿ ಏನಾಯ್ತು, ವಿಶ್ವೇಶ್ವರಯ್ಯನವರ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಒಂದು ಡಿಬೇಟ್ ಶುರುವಾಯಿತು. ಏನು ಮೆರಿಟ್ ವರ್ಸಸ್ ದ ರಿಸರ್ವೇಶನ್ ಅಂತ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಕೊನೆಗೆ ಅವರು ರಾಜೀನಾಮೆ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಮಿಲ್ಲರ್ ಸಮಿತಿ ನೇಮಕ ಆಯಿತು. ಆ ಮಿಲ್ಲರ್ ಸಮಿತಿ 1918ರಲ್ಲಿ ತನ್ನ ವರದಿಯನ್ನ 19ರಲ್ಲಿ ವರದಿಯನ್ನ ಕೊಡ್ತದೆ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಅದು 1921ರಲ್ಲಿ ಜಾರಿಗೊಳ್ತದೆ. It was not implemented. Miller Committee recommendations were not implemented up to 1921, though the committee report was submitted in 1919 for various reasons. And this committee, this non-Brahmin movement and the recommendations of the committee, if you closely look at, were nothing but the continuation of the stream of social reforms. So in a way, we have to situate non-Brahmin movement and also further the Dalit movement. Okay. The non-Brahmin movement of Mysore, to begin with, it was the a movement of a certain major communities. It did not include the lower bottom of the society. So when it did not include, further there was a new deviation from this, which emerged as a Dalit movement. So there were people like MC Raja, at the All India level, and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. The kind of pivotal role that he played from 1920 and onwards. He was the one who, created an alternative method of protest. And ultimately, for him, constitutional method was the only method. No question of, making people or with a sense of appeasement. No question of appeasement. So therefore, he always stuck to this idea of constitutionalism as the only liberating tool or liberating method for the issues of these downtrodden classes. So that also had repercussions in Mysorean state. And in 1930s, Gandhi brought this issue of Harijan, and that became an all India issue. For the first time, the issue of Dalits became an issue of public domain for discourse. So ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಗಾಂಧಿ ಮತ್ತು ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರ ನಡುವಿನ ಈ ಒಂದು ಚರ್ಚೆಗಳು 1930 ಅಂದ್ರೆ ರೌಂಡ್ ಟೇಬಲ್ ಕಾನ್ಫರೆನ್ಸ್ ಶುರುವಾದ ನಂತರ, ಅದು 1933 ನಂತರದಲ್ಲಿ ಹರಿಜನ ಸೇವಕ ಸಂಘ ಶುರು ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು 1934 ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ. ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರು 1 ವರ್ಷ ಅದರ ಸದಸ್ಯರಾಗಿರ್ತಾರೆ, ನಂತರ ರಾಜೀನಾಮೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟು ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಬರ್ತಾರೆ. ಆನಂತರ ಅವರು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ರೀತಿಯ ಸಂಸ್ಥೆಗಳನ್ನು ಹುಟ್ಟಾಕಿದ್ದು ಇವೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಕೂಡ ನಮಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿರುವಂತದ್ದೇ. ಸೊ ಹೀಗೆ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ನಾನು ಬಹುಶಃ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು 2-3 ನಿಮಿಷದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದನ್ನ ಒಂದು 5 ನಿಮಿಷದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದನ್ನ ಸಮಪ್ ಮಾಡಿ ನಂತರ ನಿಮಗೆ ಚರ್ಚೆಗೆ ಟೈಮ್ ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ. ಇನ್ನೆಷ್ಟಿದೆ ಟೈಮ್ ಈಗ ಈ ಸೆಷನ್ಗೆ? ಇನ್ನು 15 ನಿಮಿಷ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ?
ಇಲ್ಲ, 5 ನಿಮಿಷ ಸರ್.
ಓಕೆ. ಸೊ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು 5 ನಿಮಿಷಕ್ಕೆ ನಾನು ಅದನ್ನು ಸಮಪ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಆನಂತರ ಯಾರಾದ್ರೂ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳು ಕೇಳೋದಿದ್ರೆ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಮುಖಾಂತರ ನಾವು ಅದನ್ನು ಕಂಟಿನ್ಯೂ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋಬಹುದು ಅಂತ ಅನ್ಕೊಳ್ತೀವಿ. ಓಕೆ. ಸೊ ಗಾಂಧಿ ಮತ್ತು ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ನಡುವಿನ ಈ ಚರ್ಚೆಗಳು 1930ರ ದಶಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಆಗಿದ್ದಾವೆ. ಸೊ ಅಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಈ ಜಾತಿ ಕುರಿತ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳು, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಅಸ್ಪೃಶ್ಯತೆಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂತ ಚರ್ಚೆಗಳು, ಅವು ಕೇವಲ ಸ್ಥಳೀಯವಾಗಿರದೇನೆ ಈಗ ಅವುಗಳು ಒಂದು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯ ವ್ಯಾಪ್ತಿಯನ್ನ ಪಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದನ್ನ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಗಾಂಧಿ ಅವರು ಬಹಳ ಇಶ್ಯೂ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಜಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಎಲೆಕ್ಟ್ರೇಟ್ ವರ್ಸಸ್ ಸಪರೇಟ್ ಎಲೆಕ್ಟ್ರೇಟ್ ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಇಶ್ಯೂ. ಅದು ಸಪರೇಟ್ ಎಲೆಕ್ಟ್ರೇಟ್ ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರು ಅದನ್ನು ಪ್ರಪೋಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ರಾಮ್ಸೆ ಮೆಕ್ಡೊನಾಲ್ಡ್ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಕಮ್ಯುನಲ್ ಅವಾರ್ಡ್ ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಕಾಯ್ದೆಯನ್ನು ಗಾಂಧಿ ಅದನ್ನ ವಿರೋಧಿಸಿ ಉಪವಾಸ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು. ಅನಂತರ ಪೂನಾ ಪ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್, ಗಾಂಧಿ ಮತ್ತು ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಆದಂತ ಪೂನಾ ಪ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ ಇತ್ಯಾದಿ ಈ ನರೇಟಿವ್ಸ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿದೆ. ಸೊ ಈ ಒಂದು ನರೇಟಿವ್ ಅನ್ನು ಬಹಳ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ಗಮನಿಸಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ, ವಿವಿಧ ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಸಮಾಜ ಸುಧಾರಣೆ ಅಂತನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಸ್ವರೂಪಗಳಲ್ಲೇನಿತ್ತು, ಅದು ಹಾಗೆ ಒಂದು ಹರಿಯುವ ನದಿಯಾಗಿ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟಗಳ ಹರ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬಂದು, ಅದು ಸ್ತ್ರೀಯರಿಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂತ ಇಶ್ಯೂಸ್ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಅಥವಾ ಈ ಕೆಳವರ್ಗಗಳಿಗೆ, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಅಸ್ಪೃಶ್ಯ ವರ್ಗಗಳಿಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂತ ಇಶ್ಯೂಗಳಾಗಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಅವು ಚಾರಿತ್ರಿಕವಾಗಿ ಹಾಗೆ ಹರಿದು ಬಂದು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ರೀತಿಯ ಒಂದು ರೀತಿಯ ಆಯಾಮಗಳನ್ನ ಪಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾರೇನೆ. ಅದು 20ನೇ ಶತಮಾನಕ್ಕೆ ಹರಿದು ಬಂದಂತಹ ರೀತಿ. ಮತ್ತು 20ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಗಾಂಧಿ ಮತ್ತು ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರ ನಡುವಿನ ಈ ಚರ್ಚೆಗಳು ಮತ್ತು ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷರ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಅದರ ಒಳ ಹಿತಾಸಕ್ತಿಗಳ ಕಾರಣದಿಂದ ಇದು ಬೇರೆ ರೀತಿಯ ಒಂದು ಆಯಾಮವನ್ನ ಪಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದು. ಅದೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಕೂಡ ಬಹಳ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಗಮನಿಸಬೇಕು. ಈ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನವೂ ಕೂಡ ಸೋಷಿಯಲ್ ರಿಫಾರ್ಮ್ ಒಟ್ಟು ಏನು ಅದರ ಫೈನಲ್ ಕಲ್ಮಿನೇಷನ್ ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾಣ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರ ಚಳವಳಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾಣ್ತೀವಿ. ಅದು ಕೊನೆಗೆ ಒಂದು ತಾರ್ಕಿಕ ಅಂತ್ಯವನ್ನ ತಲುಪಿದ್ದೆಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಂವಿಧಾನದ ರೂಪುಗೊಳ್ಳುವಿಕೆಯಲ್ಲಿ 1946ರಿಂದ ಡಿಸೆಂಬರ್ 9ನೇ ತಾರೀಕಿಂದ 1950 ಜನವರಿ 26ನೇ ತಾರೀಕಿವರೆಗೂ ಏನು ನಾವು ಇದನ್ನ ಒಂದು ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟವನ್ನು ನೋಡ್ತೀವಿ, ಅದು ಬಹಳ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದ ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟ. ಆ ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟದಲ್ಲಿ ಇಲ್ಲಿವರೆಗೂ ಏನು ಚಾರಿತ್ರಿಕವಾಗಿ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಧಾರೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ರೂಪಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಇಷ್ಟೆಲ್ಲ ಹರಿದು ಬಂತು, ಅವೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಕೂಡ ತಾರ್ಕಿಕವಾಗಿ ಒಂದು ಕಾನೂನಿನ ಚೌಕಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಬಂದಂಥದ್ದು. ಮತ್ತು ಆ ಮೂಲಕ ಈ ಒಂದು ಏನೋ ಬಿಡುಗಡೆ ಅಥವಾ ಲಿಬರೇಷನ್, ಈ ಅನೇಕ ಸ್ತ್ರೀಯರ ಸಮುದಾಯ ಇರಬಹುದು, ಅದರ ಸ್ತ್ರೀಯರ ಒಳಗಡೆ ಇರುವಂತಹ ವಿವಿಧ ಸಮುದಾಯಗಳಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಅಥವಾ ಈ ದಲಿತ ವರ್ಗ, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಅಸ್ಪೃಶ್ಯತ ವರ್ಗ ಇರ್ಬೋದು, ಅಥವಾ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣೇತರ ಇತರೆ ವರ್ಗಗಳಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಅವೆಲ್ಲಕ್ಕೂ ಕೂಡ ತಾರ್ಕಿಕವಾಗಿ ಒಂದು ಅಂತ್ಯ ಆಡುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಕೊನೆಯ ಏನೋ ಒಂದು ಹಂತವನ್ನ ನಾವು ಈ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಂವಿಧಾನ ಎನ್ನುವ ದಾಖಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಕಾಣ್ತೀವಿ. ಸೊ ಹೀಗಾಗಿ ಒಂದು ಕಾಲಕ್ಕೆ ಶಾಸ್ತ್ರಗಳು ಅದನ್ನ ಹೇಳಬೇಕು, ಅದನ್ನ ನಮಗೆ ಪ್ರಮಾಣಿತ ಆಗಬೇಕು ಅಂತನ್ನುವಂತ ಇದ್ದಂತ ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟದಿಂದ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಆದಂಥದ್ದು ಇವತ್ತು ನಮ್ಮ ಸಂವಿಧಾನ ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಏನ್ ಹೇಳುತ್ತೆ ಅನ್ನುವಷ್ಟರ ಮಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ನಾವು ಇಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಬಂದು ನಿಂತಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಸೊ ಇದರ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಇರುವಂತಹ ಈ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಧಾರೆ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದರ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಚಾರಿತ್ರಿಕ ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟಗಳನ್ನ ನಾವು ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತೀವಿ. So we need to understand that how the different streams of social reforms from the time immemorial and which have been shaped by different forces at various phases in history, be it in the medieval period, be it or earlier to that in the ancient period, or when we come to the modern period, in the backdrop of the automation of the colonial structure, and finally how these movements got crystallized into different and distinct movements, and finally the debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar, a very significant debate, and thereafter finally many of these issues found their logical conclusions in the Indian Constitution, in the framing of the Indian Constitution. So therefore, in a way, what I would say as a student of social science, our Constitution is the product of these several historical streams, okay, now being visualized into a huge philosophical text, a text for the future. I would end here. If there are any questions, probably through questions we can expand our discussion. Thank you.